This special presentation is brought to you by the National Firearms Association. Freedom, safety, responsibility. Trapper Gord, the greatest outdoor store in the world.
Over 230,000 Canadians stood united in asking the government for the following: to call upon the government to scrap the May 1st, 2020 Order in Council decision related to confiscating legally owned firearms and instead pass legislation that will target criminals, stop the smuggling of firearms into Canada, and go after those who illegally acquire firearms, and apologize to legal firearms owners in Canada.
Calgary Nose Hill MP Michelle Rempel-Garner presenting the largest petition in parliamentary history. 230,000 signatures.
It calls on the Liberal government to scrap Bill C-21 and the ban on 1,500 military-style assault weapons.
Getting these weapons off our streets and out of the hands of criminals means less violence.
The reality is, gun violence is on the rise. The government says violent gun crimes have skyrocketed more than 80% since 2009. Triple the number of break-ins where guns were stolen, and that 1 in 3 homicides in Canada are committed with a firearm. I'm Joel Gottlieb.
And I'm Danielle Smith. Welcome to this Wild TV news special, where we will delve into both sides of the issue. We'll hear from the politicians, police, a leading researcher on gun smuggling, and more this hour. For those of you who don't know, Joel has been a journalist for almost 3 decades, anchoring, reporting, and producing local newscasts at TV stations across the country, most recently in Edmonton.
And Danielle is also an accomplished journalist based in Calgary. She's hosted her own current affairs programs on television and radio. Danielle is also a former politician who led Alberta's Wild Rose Party to official opposition status.
We're joining forces to bring you a fair, balanced, and in-depth analysis of one of Canada's most hotly contested issues, the Liberal ban on 1,500 assault-style semi-automatic weapons and Bill C-21, which, if passed, would lead to the toughest gun laws ever seen in our country.
Canada's gun lobby is fighting back, and we'll hear from the man leading their battle to stop Bill C-21 from becoming law. There are more than 2 million law-abiding gun owners in Canada who are some of the most vetted people in our country.
One of them, a PAL card-carrying firearms owner for decades, a devoted family man who dedicated his career to protect and serve the 3 million people who live in the Greater Toronto Area. 2.5 years ago, his teenage daughter was suddenly caught in a hail of gunfire on Toronto's Danforth Avenue.
What happened on that hot July night in 2018 turned into the trigger point that fueled the Liberal government's collision course with Canada's gun lobby.
A 29-year-old man with a history of mental illness went on a shooting rampage in the city's Greektown. Innocent bystanders suddenly caught in a hail of bullets. And when it was over, a 10-year-old girl and an 18-year-old girl lay dead. 13 others were injured before the gunman killed himself.
Toronto police later confirmed the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson M&P handgun used in the shooting was stolen from a gun shop in Avonlea, Saskatchewan.
Days after the tragedy, the mayor of Canada's largest city calls for a ban on handguns.
Why does anybody in the city of Toronto need to have a handgun? I don't think they do, and if this is one more way of getting those handguns out of our city, then I'm in favor of doing it.
Gun crime in Toronto doesn't let up after that either. 2019 sets a record for a city once referred to by locals as Toronto the Good.
492 shootings, the most ever recorded in Ontario's capital city, and the highest number of people killed or injured by a gun.
2019 also marked the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history. In April, a 51-year-old man killed 22 people on a Nova Scotia-wide shooting rampage, including an RCMP officer. Investigators confirm the shooter's weapons were smuggled in from the United States. Nova Scotia's tragedy comes almost 30 years after 14 women were shot and killed in École Polytechnique in Montreal.
About a month after the Nova Scotia tragedy, the Liberal government passed Bill C-71, amending sections of the Criminal Code and Firearms Act. It expands background checks for people who want to buy a gun, forces gun shop owners to expand their record keeping, and puts an end to grandfathering firearms.
And then on May 1st of 2020, a bombshell is dropped on Canada's gun owners.
Canadians called for these bold steps. We heard you, and we are taking action.
The Liberal government bans 1,500 makes and models of what it calls military-grade assault-style weapons.
The types used in the attacks we mentioned earlier are on the list.
When it comes to keeping Canadians safe from gun violence, we need more than thoughts and prayers. We need concrete action.
Most gun shop owners are shocked to find out through an email that the bulk of their stock is now banned. Tens of thousands of dollars of inventory seemingly worthless now.
Bill C-21 is tabled in Parliament. Second reading got underway in late February.
Gun ownership in Canada, in this country, is a privilege and not a right. There is nothing in the measures that we are bringing forward intended to interfere or make more difficult the activities of legitimate hunting and sport activities with firearms. But we also recognize that firearms in the wrong hands or in the wrong circumstances can result in tragic outcomes.
If it's passed before the next election, Bill C-21 would create stricter laws on storing and transporting firearms. It would give municipalities the right to ban handguns, and it would make it easier for police to seize guns from people who pose a threat to themselves or others.
It would also increase prison terms for smuggling and trafficking firearms, provide $250 million over 5 years for anti-gang programming, and give owners of newly banned firearms a chance to get some cash back through a buyback program. The government's estimated cost for that between $300 and $400 million.
It's modeled after New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's program. It came in after 51 Muslim worshippers at 2 different mosques were shot and killed by an anti-immigrant gunman on March 15th of 2019. The New Zealand government spent $140 million. They collected 56,000 guns, but analysts believe tens of thousands are still out there.
Meantime, back here in Canada, investigators later revealed that the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson M&P handgun in Toronto's Danforth shooting spree was stolen from a gun shop in Avonlea, Saskatchewan.
That is a quick summary of how we got to this point. Up next, we'll talk to one of the most outspoken critics of the gun ban and Bill C-21, Shannon Stubbs.
This special presentation is brought to you by the National Firearms Association. Freedom, safety, responsibility. Trapper Gord, the greatest outdoor store in the world. And brought to you by Vortex Canada.
Our next guest is the chief critic of Bill C-21 and the Liberals' gun ban. Shannon Stubbs is the MP for Lakeland and the official opposition shadow minister to Public Safety Minister Bill Blair.
We asked Minister Blair to appear on this program, but the former Toronto police chief and architect of Bill C-21 declined. Before we get to our interview with Shannon Stubbs, here's what the minister had to say to Canadians when explaining his party's plan.
Under our legislation, current owners of these weapons will be required to comply with strict new regulations, which will effectively eliminate all legal use of these firearms by private owners. They will not be able to legally discharge these weapons at a range or anywhere else. They cannot be transported, sold, traded, transferred, or bequeathed. And we will also define strict new secure storage requirements. And finally, all persons wishing to retain these firearms will be required to obtain a license to possess them and register all prohibited weapons in their possession. With these measures, it will enable authorities to know exactly who has such firearms, what they have, and where they are stored. And violating any of these requirements could result in serious criminal charges. We know that the vast majority of Canadians who previously acquired these firearms did so legally, and that they will continue to obey the law. We also know that as these new measures will eliminate all legal use of these weapons, the majority of existing owners will have no reason to retain them. We are creating the appropriate conditions and protections to facilitate a fair, respectful, and safe buyback program for these newly prohibited weapons.
All right, we are now talking with the Conservative Party of Canada Shadow Minister for National Security to get her reaction to what she heard Bill Blair have to say. It seems to me, Ms. Stubbs, he keeps talking that he's not trying to target legal firearms owners, legal hunters, legal sport shooters, but from what we just heard, it sounds like that's exactly what he's doing.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking, that particular clip, he admits right there, doesn't he, that his law is targeted to Canadians who he admitted were already law-abiding, already owning and using and transporting and storing and registering their guns legally. Yet the Liberals try to claim that C-21 will enhance public safety and will somehow stop shootings in cities like Toronto, where there were almost 500 last year alone, the vast majority of done with illegal guns through gang crime and other criminal activity.
I keep getting caught up on this language that they use, that it's assault style, military assault style firearms. And yet, if that was the case, it shouldn't impact hunters and it shouldn't impact sport shooters, but it does. So what am I missing? There's a disconnect here.
They do use this term assault style weapons, but of course the fact is that those type of weapons have been illegal and prohibited for use in Canada since the 1970s. What the Liberals have done is, as of last May, automatically turned, at that time, 1,500 firearms, but because they also use this term variants, which is undefined now, is close to 2,000 firearms that were previously legal, which are now in the process of being made illegal and turning their law-abiding owners into criminals unless they comply with what is a whole series of basically a new registry.
Is there any type of legislation that the Conservative government would come up with, if voted into power, that could meet halfway on this issue for those who want to see tougher gun laws?
Overall, on firearms legislation, the reality is, as most law enforcement experts are saying, Canada has already some of the most stringent, strictest, rigorous, and vigorous firearms legislation in the world. And so what Conservatives are saying is that if the aim, as we believe it ought to be, is about reducing crime with guns, reducing shootings, then the emphasis needs to be on cracking down on the criminals who are carrying out those crimes in the first place, and also on those other areas to support prevention of youth at risk from getting into those lifestyles. I mean, this is part of the economic picture too, that young people and communities have to have job opportunities and secure social safety nets. But we do not think that the emphasis should be going after already law-abiding firearms owners, sport shooters, collectors, and rural people and urban firearms owners across the country.
All right, Shannon Stubbs, thank you so much for your thoughts today. Appreciate your time.
When we come back, the president of Canada's National Firearms Association weighs in.
Closed captioning of this program brought to you by Trinity Long Range, Prairie Gun Traders, Dante Sports, and KKS Tactical.
We all know we'll be hearing from the well-funded gun lobby, and we all know there will be plenty of politics. But let's not forget what this is about: saving lives.
With an election call expected soon, the Liberals are trying to ram through their gun legislation. The opposition says there's been little debate in Parliament on Bill C-21 compared to other bills.
That's just one of many things the head of Canada's biggest gun lobby considers undemocratic and unfair to Canada's law-abiding gun owners. Here now is Sheldon Clare, president of the National Firearms Association. Sheldon, Clare, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Danielle. It's good to see you and Joel
Well, let's
today.
begin by talking about where this bill began and where it ended up, because it seems like nobody ended up happy with what the bill ultimately looked like. Tell us, what are your members telling you about it?
Well, they're telling us that this is completely unacceptable, and it's just a continuation of the 50 years of civil disarmament agenda that the successive Liberal governments and the Red Tory Kim Campbells foisted upon Canadian firearms owners without any good reason, without any evidence, without any possibility of changing violent behavior. This is all about taking a run at ordinary Canadians who own and use firearms in their daily lives for hunting, target use, sports shooting, protection, collection, reenactment, airsoft, pellet gun use, anything you care to name. This is an attempt to attack a culture, to attack our heritage. It isn't anything else.
The gun control advocates were clearly looking for something more. They wanted to see a mandatory gun buyback. They wanted to see it implemented immediately. So they're unhappy. What is it that you're unhappy about?
In terms of what they want, well, they're always talking about compromise. Well, you guys should give up this and it'll be public safety. This has nothing whatsoever to do with public safety and everything to do with getting all the guns eventually. It's not a slippery slope argument. It's an incremental process that has been long enacted by successive governments. We've seen this go on and on for 50 years. I go back to the 1978 legislation C-51. I've been down this road many times. I've had lots of my firearms classified prohibited and be forced to be remaining in my house unused, untouched, and this is not acceptable. It's stealing people's property, it's destroying the value of that property, and these are people who have done nothing whatsoever to deserve this kind of treatment.
Now, I know that this kind of approach has been taken elsewhere, like in New Zealand. I think the government has upped the amount that they're setting aside for the buyback program, $400 million. How do you think your members are going to respond to that? Is that going to be enough to compensate?
Well, I think, first of all, if they actually think they're going to go through with this, it's going to be a cost in the billions. And I don't see anybody taking the 30 pieces of silver to give up their stuff.
There's a bridge that needs to be built between the two sides if anybody's to come to an understanding on this. What's your message to the Canadians who want to see all the guns off of our streets?
I don't agree that most Canadians want to see all guns banned or all handguns banned even. I think that most Canadians actually really don't care much about this particular issue. The people who do care about this particular issue and have the numbers are the people who are firearms owners. That's a large group. There's 2.2 million people who have possession acquisition licenses in Canada, and there's probably another 4 million people in Canada who have firearms but are not involved in criminal activity other than they don't have the license. And this is a big number of people. And these are not people engaged in criminal activity. This is something that is not easily going to be bridged because they're mutually exclusive positions. If someone who is in the minority of the gun grabbers says they want to take away guns because it's about public safety, well, first of all, it's not about public safety. It's about theft of property. And in the game of buyback that they're putting out there, that's just legislated theft, taking away people's property, using their own tax dollars to do it.
What research are you aware of that the government has included in coming up with these policies?
I think the government isn't basing what their findings are on research. I think they're basing it on emotion and ideological goals. The research that has not been refuted, the peer-reviewed research, for example, by that of Dr. Gary Mauser, and especially that of Dr. Kaylin Langman, clearly demonstrates that none of the Canadian firearms control efforts in the last 50 years have had any effect whatsoever on crime reduction. So this clearly isn't about crime. This is about an ideological agenda to get rid of firearms ownership generally and to start to attack hunting. We're seeing this in several jurisdictions. And it's generally a major philosophical difference that is not going to be bridged.
And one last thing here, the Prime Minister did say, quote, "We're not targeting law-abiding citizens who own guns for hunting or sport shooting. The measures we are proposing are concrete and practical," he says. Your answer to that? The measures he is proposing are targeting ordinary Canadians. They have nothing whatsoever to do with attacking or going after criminals. They will have no effect on criminal activity. Putting a license beside a person or a firearm, a registration certificate by a firearm, has nothing whatsoever to do with a bad choice or a violent goal.
perpetuated by a person. It will have no effect whatsoever on that. Well, he is mounting talking points, going after modern sporting firearms, and he has gone with a wide swath. They've foolishly gone after things they don't have any idea of who owns them or where they are, and quite frankly, he's going in for a hell of a fight.
Let me ask you a question about crime, because you'd mentioned that this is not the way to address it. MP Michelle Rempel-Garner put forward just this month a petition in the Parliament signed by 230,000 Canadians wanting them to repeal the approach on the Order in Council taken last year that would put 1,500 guns at risk of being confiscated, but importantly focus on the issue of crime and gangs and smuggling. What do you think that would look like? If the government was really focusing on those issues, what would they do differently?
What can the government do to alleviate crime and smuggling and all of these problems? Well, you get rid of the demand by providing economic opportunities for people rather than trying to provide equality of outcome all the time. If we were not doing this authoritarian statist socialist behavior and we were instead concentrating on making people giving people the opportunity to work and to contribute to the economy, you would find a lot less poverty, which pushes people into crime. So I think what they need to do is get Canada back to work and quit playing around pretending that tinkering with people's rights and freedoms regarding firearms ownership has anything to do with solving crime problems, which they have created themselves through their economic policies.
All right. Sheldon, we both want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and opinions with us. Sheldon Clare, President and CEO of the National Firearms Association. Thank you.
When we return, a former Toronto gang leader now in a fight to stop gun violence.
On May 1st at 11:15, the Trudeau government punished over 2.2 million Canadians with a rule-by-decree firearms ban based on emotion and virtue signaling without due process or evidence-based rationale to support it. Canada's National Firearms Association is working hard for your firearms rights. We are lobbying on behalf of firearms owners so you can continue the Canadian tradition of hunting and sport shooting. The NFA promotes all safe firearms activities, including the right to self-defense. We support firearms education and fight to protect your right to own and use firearms. It is essential that you join NFA and contribute to this fight. Go to nfa.ca for information on bad gun laws and what you can do to make your voice heard. That's nfa.ca. A message from Canada's National Firearms Association. Freedom, safety, responsibility.
And now, to a former Toronto gang leader who turned his life around before it was too late.
Marcel Wilson is in a different battle now to keep communities safe. He knows the streets and the roots of most big city gun crime. The founder and president of the One by One movement joins us now.
Why did you get into the gang life? What brought you there?
In my personal story, there are a few reasons. I grew up in what we call the Metro Toronto housing, which is now TCH, considered marginalized community. There was a lack of opportunities there. There was a culture of violence that came to our city within the 90s, early 2000s, through urban culture, hip hop, rap music, things along those lines. And I was influenced by others. Based on leaving home at a young age, there was some family dynamics going on there. So I believe those are a lot of the things that led me in that direction. I was seeking acceptance.
And when you got into that scene, Marcel, how easy was it to get your hands on a gun?
This is in the early 2000s, late 90s, and even then it was quite easy to find a weapon.
How? You say it was easy, but how?
Really?
Can you give us an example?
So in my area, we had older guys that we refer to as OGs, that were already operating in the area. And when you live a certain lifestyle in any city, you should be able to access them quite quickly through having those kinds of.
Can you talk more, Marcel, about why guns are so important in gang culture? I mean, I think there's the obvious reason, maybe for protection, maybe for intimidation, but is it a form of currency as well? I've read a couple of stories on that. I think we need to understand why guns are so vital when you're in a gang.
Absolutely. It's definitely a form of currency, but where it holds its most weight is wielding power and fear. Back in my day, when I was an active gang member, it was a tool, simply a tool in the kit in order to gain or make more money. Now it seems that symbol has changed. It's almost a complete symbol of power within the gang culture.
So if that is the issue, then how do you address getting guns out of the hands of those who are in gangs or who want to use them for crime? Is there something that you think would be effective?
Well, we focus on the root causes, the whys behind why does someone want to pick up a gun and harm another human being. So I think if we really focused on that component, the preventative measures of why somebody would want to harm somebody, I think to us that is the solution, especially coming from where we have come from.
Can you elaborate a bit more on some of those root causes are? Why somebody would want to hurt someone?
We've identified several risk factors that lead to this behavior. Some of the main ones would be obviously poverty and lack of opportunity. There are also abuse issues in some cases in the home. Some of it has to do with the culture of violence that we're seeing these days in music and art. Social media is contributing in a big way. That's something that we weren't used to in my day.
Putting a ban on 1,500 assault-style weapons, as the Liberal government calls it, and banning handguns, which is a decision that the Liberals are leaving up really to the municipalities. Don't you think it'll make a difference?
I do not.
Why?
Well, I was a former gang leader. Unfortunately, one of the activities that we engaged in was importing weapons and using them. And never once did we obtain a firearm through any legal channels or any type of straw purchasing.
So it's really going after smuggling, yes?
Correct. I think we focus a lot more on our borders and what's going on there.
Marcel, I wonder if you can just leave us with a message of hope. You've been involved in starting the 1x1 movement, and you've been in operation for a couple of years now. Is there some successes that you can share with us?
Absolutely. People want better. We have a plague of violence in Toronto right now. And a lot of the young people are starting to realize that this is a huge problem. So every day we have new people reaching out to us. And we're talking about people on the perpetrator side of things here that are realizing that this has gone too far. This is too much. So we're proud that people are starting to reach out, especially within the prison systems, and we encourage that they continue to do so. And hopefully we can put them on the right path as we have with so many others so far. We just need support and help.
Well, Marcel Wilson, you're doing some fantastic work there. We hope it spreads across the country. Marcel Wilson is, of course, the founder of the group 1x1, a movement out of Toronto to address gang violence and to stop kids from joining and to help get them out of the lifestyle. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Marcel's organization should be one of the anti-gang programs that qualifies for part of the $250 million announced in Bill C-21.
Up next, a retired Edmonton police chief and one of the world's leading researchers on gun smuggling.
Welcome back. One of the world's top minds on law enforcement co-authored a 2014 Queen's University study on smuggling busts. We wanted to discover how illegal guns make their way into our country. Canada borders the largest weapons market in the world.
One case involved a smuggler using a Toronto College dropout who smuggled weapons in a secret compartment of a gas tank. Another smuggling recruiter bought guns legally at a Detroit gun shop, then hired 4 cash-strapped women to work as mules to take them across the border. These are just a couple of examples. The study concluded that smuggling operations from the U.S. to Canada don't require a complex network, which makes them hard to stop.
Political scientist Christian Leuprecht joins us now, along with retired Edmonton Police Chief Dave Castles.
All right, Christian Leuprecht and Dave Castles, thanks so much for joining us today. Christian, I wanted to start with you. We've just done a bit of a rundown on the 2014 study that you did looking at a number of the busts on smuggling. And it struck me reading through that is it seems like no matter what we do in Canada, guns are still going to make their way across the border and into the hands of criminals. So shouldn't we really be focusing our efforts on busting up some of those smuggling lines?
Look, we live next door to the largest weapons market in the world, and that's not going to change. And so as a result, there's always going to be a flow for illicit product that is more difficult to obtain in Canada across the border. And firearms, given how readily available they are in the United States, are always going to be a prime target, whether it's individuals that are taking them over with them, whether they're smuggled individually with GPS magnetic boxes on the cars, or they're smuggled in large-scale networks that bring them across the border. And so this is, I think, a reality we need to live with. So given that we can't control the supply side from the US, what we can control is the demand side for firearms in Canada, and we can control the demand side, the supply side in terms of domestic firearms. And how we do that is, of course, highly political.
So, Dave, I want to ask you this. As a former police chief, you've seen crimes, you've seen what guns can do. What do you like in this legislation?
Well, I like the legislation that's going to prohibit the military-style weapons, the buyback program to get these off the street. I don't accept the fact that is stated as a fact that the majority of the gun crimes in Canada are smuggled weapons. I believe that my experience over years tells me that a high percentage of the guns that are involved in crimes in Canada are legally acquired weapons that are used illegally. They either fall into the hands of the wrong people or they're used by their own owners. And as a result, look at the tragedies that we have with these style of weapons. Now, I'm not saying that the legislation is perfect, but I do believe it will make a significant contribution from this perspective in public safety.
Let me turn it back to Christian then. So whether it's getting into the hands of gangs and criminals because of the legal market in Canada or the legal market in the United States, I think people are asking the question, is this going to work? Is that going to make a dent in crime? Is it going to make a dent in how they're used by gangs?
So it depends what your target is, right? So I think Dave rightly refers to the broad range of gun offenses in this country. But the government's motivation for this legislation purportedly was the infamous shooting on the Danforth and the particular concern about handguns, and in particular handguns used in urban areas for criminal offenses, and handguns in particular also used for gang violence within urban areas. And so while I find assault-style weapons reprehensible myself, I'm not sure that taking assault-style weapons out of the hands of individuals is going to solve the problem that we have in terms of urban gun violence in general and gang-related urban gun violence in particular. So we need to think about what is the best policy instrument to achieve a particular objective. And I think this is where the waters get muddied politically, because there are so many different interests, everybody from very progressive urban voters to people who just really like their firearms, and we've already told them you can't have large clips. We've put restrictions on them and how they can transport their firearms, and who are saying, well, how is my firearm so much more reprehensible than a big pickup truck that pollutes the environment, or for instance, pornography that does just as much harm to individuals. Rural
individuals look at firearms as tools to manage their properties, to manage predators. Those who are in the sports shooting world, they don't look at them as weapons. They look at them as a recreational activity. So what is it that urban individuals maybe need to understand about how gun owners see this issue and why they oppose this type of approach.
If you're a park ranger in rural British Columbia and you don't have a firearm, then that really puts your life, exposes you to serious harm and to serious risk. And there's many areas in this country where firearms are legitimate tools, either for the purpose of where people live, or where people are using these weapons in a licensed manner according with legislation. I think this is where many, for instance, hunters will object that many of the weapons that are getting caught up in this broad sweep are weapons that people have used safely for hunting purposes for a long time. I'd also say that we know in terms of, for instance, gun violence, there's sort of this perception that people can randomly get sprayed by bullets at any time in wherever they might walk in Canada. And we know that the people that random shootings are extremely rare, as reprehensible as they are and as tragic as they are extremely rare. That most people who get shot affiliate with other people who carry firearms and use them for criminal purposes. And we have fantastically robust data on this across North America. And so again, it's about what do we want to target? And I think the bill is also trying to change the gun culture in Canada, which is a laudable goal in and of itself. But then let's make that explicit and say what we're trying to do with this bill is not necessarily just target particular types of crime, but we are trying to target the way Canadians view firearms and use them.
Hunters, farmers, and gun enthusiasts need to look at this objectively. They need to look at it from a different perspective. They need to understand that there is some selfishness, in my opinion, in continually in this debate trying to protect these weapons. And I'm going to draw a comparison here. A Christian can correct me if he chooses to, and that is that we are next door to a culture that has a mentality that you need to have a firearm to protect yourself. And in fact, what Americans are doing are slaughtering themselves with firearms. And I think
Dave,
if you look at the... Yes? Yes, go ahead, Danielle.
I'll get you to respond to what Christian said, though, that many of these firearms, they have been used for a long time in hunting. Is it the case, though, that the government was maybe overly broad in identifying 1,500 firearms? Maybe if they narrowed it down, we might be able to get to some kind of agreement. I mean, do you accept they made some mistakes?
I'll accept. I'm not sure if they made mistakes. I'll accept that it may be an overreach, but it's a regulatory issue which can be changed if necessary, if the National Firearms Association or groups can convince them of that. But I see it as right at the outset, they're not giving it this legislation and this buyback program and the cooperation the government wants to try and make the streets safer any interest at all. It's always about maintaining and keeping everything that they have that, in my opinion, they don't need.
Look, I think where Dave has a very important point is that one of the things legislation can do is draw a very clear line in the minds of Canadians as to what is and is not acceptable. And there seems to be some ambiguity here, and that's inherently driven by local values. So I think the government's trying to draw a clearer line. At the same time, I think we need to understand that there are many of the demand side are cultural issues. And so we need to ask ourselves, are there other things that the governments can and should be doing? Some of these elements are in the legislation, but some of them, for instance, don't require legislation. So enacting markings on guns that have been in draft regulations since 2004 and that this government has pushed off 3 times, which require no legislative change at present for the government to enact. Or, for instance, to simply become more proactive on our federal police force, making sure we actually hire people and train people with the effective skill sets to investigate the trafficking networks, both domestically and cross-border. That would also be significant impacts that we could make, but they're the things that don't get the nice sort of big flashy attention as introducing draft legislation of this sort. And so there is a this is a multifaceted problem. And I think the legislation has the right intention, but there's many things we could already be doing that we're not doing that might give us a higher payoff in the more immediate future.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to thank you both very much for your views and opinions on this. Dave Castles, Christian Lupprecht, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When we recorded this program, Bill C-21 was heading to a Commons and Senate committee where it could be amended. Then would come third and final reading in the House, and then royal assent to become law.
If the bill isn't passed before the next election, then it's dead and would have to be tabled all over again. When we come back, our final thoughts. And now our final thoughts. Joel, when this bill first came out, what'd you think of it? And what do you think of it now that we've done all these interviews?
I liked it when it first came out. I mean, I grew up in Toronto. I have 3 young children, and I want them safe and everybody else safe. But I didn't know enough about the bill. I didn't know all the fine details. I also wasn't aware of how passionate and how big Canada's gun community is. So there was a lot of information that I wasn't aware of, and I think that's the case with a number of Canadians. When it comes to this, the guns are doing damage, but the guns don't shoot themselves. People shoot the guns. And the root here, in my opinion, is more support for mental health, addressing poverty, and doing something about the gun smuggling problem. So I understand both sides of this better. Has anything changed your mind in what we've done?
And of course, I was opposed to it when it came out. I've always been a property rights advocate, and I've never understood why when governments see that there is a problem of crime in urban centers, they go after legal, law-abiding gun owners who use it principally for hunting and sport shooting. And quite frankly, I think the Liberal government continues to have a credibility problem on this issue. They keep calling them military-style assault weapons, but we've had bans on those kinds of firearms for decades. Yeah. I think that they've done it an overly broad bill that sweeps up a lot of law-abiding hunters and sport shooters into this. You're going to see mass non-compliance. You're going to see law-abiding citizens put offside with the law. You're going to see people not fairly compensated for the loss of their property. And you're going to divert hundreds of millions of dollars away from where it should be put, which is in addressing the issue of gangs and addressing the issue of smuggling.
And you have all the information to draw your own conclusion. For myself, Danielle, and the crew here, we thank you for watching.
This special presentation has been presented by the National Firearms Association. Freedom, safety, responsibility. Trapper Gourd, the greatest outdoor store in the world. And brought to you by Vortex Canada. And brought to you by Vortex Canada.
I started Biathlon when I was 13. It was perfect for me as it allowed me to combine my passion of shooting and skiing into one sport. When you're out skiing, you're surrounded by other competitors and your mindset is to go as fast as possible and just ski as hard as you can. But when you get to the range, the mindset changes and you go from a racer to a shooter. You have to slow everything down, time seems to speed up, and you have to focus on just you, your rifle, and the targets. This is my second year as a member of the Canadian national team, and I compete at the highest level of the sport. My name is Carson Campbell, and my goal is to represent my country at the 2022 Olympic Winter Games. The NFA has been supporting my athletic dreams for the past 3 years. They've helped me to improve and grow as an athlete on the range, while looking after my best interests as a Canadian firearms owner.